Crystal glasses touched softly across polished tables inside one of Ohio's most prestigious law firms. Men in expensive suits exchanged confident handshakes. Women in elegant dresses discussed investment returns over practiced smiles. Developers, executives, and wealthy families gathered beneath sparkling chandeliers, waiting to witness the signing of a multi-million-dollar redevelopment contract that promised to reshape entire communities. At the center of it all stood Richard, 36 years old, one of Ohio's most respected attorneys, calm, precise, the kind of man people trusted when fortunes, reputations, and futures were placed on paper. He reviewed the contract one final time while conversations drifted around him. "This project will change everything," one investor said proudly. "It'll be good for everyone," another replied. Nearby, cameras were being prepared. The signatures were moments away. Richard lifted his pen. The room settled into expectant silence. Then the doors burst open. A teenage voice cut through the luxury and certainty. "Stop!" Every head turned. The pen slipped from Richard's fingers and landed against the polished table. Standing near the entrance was a 17-year-old black girl, breathing hard as though she'd run across half the city to get there. Her natural curls were slightly out of place. Her clothes didn't belong in rooms like this, at least according to the expressions staring back at her. She looked around the room, chest rising and falling, then pointed directly at the contract. "You can't sign that." For one suspended moment, nobody moved, nobody blinked, nobody understood why a child had just interrupted the most important meeting of the year. Silence lasted only a heartbeat before the room exploded with reactions. "What is this? Who let her in? Is this some kind of protest?" A few people exchanged uncomfortable laughs, assuming the interruption would be handled within seconds. Near the back of the room, one executive adjusted his tie and muttered, loudly enough for others to hear, "Security should escort her out before this turns into a spectacle." Two security personnel immediately moved toward Sheila. But Sheila didn't back away. She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't apologize for being there. Instead, she tightened her hands into fists at her sides and raised her voice. "You need to stop this signing right now." The nervous laughter grew. One woman shook her head. "Sweetheart, this is a legal proceeding." Another added, with a patronizing smile, "Adults are handling this." Someone whispered what many in the room were already thinking. "Who let this child in here?" Sheila looked directly at them. "I know exactly how I got in," she replied. "The better question is whether all of you know what you're signing." That answer stole the smiles from several faces. The security guards slowed, not because of authority, because of certainty. There was no hesitation in Sheila's voice, no confusion, no attempt to seek attention, only conviction. Richard finally lifted his eyes fully toward her. Until that moment, he'd been prepared to dismiss the interruption as an unfortunate misunderstanding. But something about the way she stood there stopped him. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't guessing. She believed she was right. And somehow, that unsettled him more than the interruption itself. Before anyone could speak again, Sheila pointed toward the open contract resting on the signing table. "You skipped over something important," she said, "and if you sign that document today, families are going to pay for a mistake they never agreed to. Before we go any further, welcome back to everyone returning to love, money, and secret, and if this is your first time here, we're truly grateful. You've joined our family. Please take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Those small actions help YouTube share stories like this with more people who need them." Richard glanced down at the contract again. His expression remained controlled, but the confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier had begun to crack. One of the investors leaned forward impatiently. "Richard, with all due respect, we have an agenda. This meeting has taken months to arrange." Another waved a dismissive hand toward Sheila. "She doesn't even know what she's talking about." "Please continue with the signing," someone else added. Richard didn't respond. Instead, he looked at Sheila. "Which part?" he asked quietly. The room fell silent again. Even Sheila seemed surprised that he had asked the question. She took a cautious step forward. "Page 43, she answered. A nervous chuckle escaped one of the executives. "She's bluffing." "Page 43? Another repeated mockingly. "What did she? Memorize legal documents for fun?" Sheila ignored them. "Third paragraph from the bottom." Richard slowly flipped through the pages. The sound of paper turning echoed through the room. Page after page, until he reached page 43. His eyes moved down the document, then stopped. He read the paragraph once, then again. The color drained from his face. The room noticed immediately. Richard never lost composure, not in negotiations, not in courtrooms, not during million-dollar disputes. Yet now, standing before Ohio's most influential people, one of the state's most respected attorneys had gone completely still. Richard? An investor asked uneasily. He didn't answer. His fingers tightened around the edge of the document. Then Sheila spoke again. And this time her words didn't just interrupt the meeting. They reached into a part of Richard's life he had spent years protecting. You promised, she said softly, that no family would ever lose their home because adults were too busy protecting their own interests. Richard's hand trembled. Because that promise had been made years ago, in private, and nobody in this room should have known it existed. A stunned hush swept through the room. The whispers stopped. The impatient tapping of expensive watches ceased. Even the security guards stood frozen, uncertain whether they were still supposed to escort Sheila out. Richard stared at her. For the first time in years, he looked less like the attorney everyone admired and more like a man trying to understand how the ground beneath him had shifted. How? One executive began before stopping himself. An investor frowned. What promise? Another turned toward Richard. Is there something we should know? Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. His gaze returned to Sheila, 17 years old, simple clothes, standing alone in a room full of power. Yet somehow she carried herself with more certainty than many of the people seated around the polished tables. Sheila swallowed hard. Despite the confidence in her voice, she could feel dozens of eyes studying her, waiting for her to crack. She didn't. You told someone that people who trust the system deserve honesty. From the people running it, she said. You said contracts should protect families, not quietly push them aside. Richard's jaw tightened. He remembered those words, every single one of them. He had spoken them years ago, never expecting to hear them repeated in a room like this. A room where cameras waited, where investors expected signatures, where reputations were built on appearing certain. One woman lowered her glass onto the table. Richard, she said carefully, who is this girl? Before he could answer, Sheila lifted her chin and looked directly at him. You can sign those papers, she said, but if you do, you'll break the promise you made. And suddenly the multi-million-dollar contract was no longer the most important thing in the room. Before we continue, let's take a brief moment together. Heavenly Father, give us the courage to stand for what is right even when our voices shake and others doubt us. Help us choose integrity over convenience, compassion over pride, and truth over silence. Bless everyone watching today with wisdom, protection, and peace. May we never be afraid to do the right thing. Amen. Welcome to Love, Money, and Secret, where America's greatest stories and life lessons meet creativity and heart. If you're new to the family, we're grateful to have you here. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It helps us bring more unforgettable stories your way. Nobody spoke. The silence inside the law firm carried a different weight now. Only minutes earlier, people had arrived expecting celebration, a few signatures, a few photographs, a few speeches about progress and opportunity. Instead, they found themselves watching one teenage girl challenge a room filled with people who had spent their entire lives being listened to. Richard slowly closed the contract. The sharp sound echoed across the room. Immediately, protests erupted. You can't be serious. We've invested too much money. This project has already been approved. Richard, this is highly inappropriate. One executive stood up from his chair. With respect, we're allowing emotions to interfere with facts. Richard looked down at the folder resting beneath his hands. Facts. His entire career had been built on facts, evidence, precision, careful preparation. Yet a 17-year-old girl had just exposed something he had overlooked. Or perhaps something he hadn't wanted to look at closely enough. His eyes lifted toward Sheila again. For the first time since she burst through those doors, he noticed something beyond her determination. She wasn't trying to embarrass him. She wasn't chasing attention. She wasn't enjoying the chaos unfolding around her. She looked scared. Not for herself. For the people who would never step foot inside rooms like this. Families too busy working double shifts. Grandparents raising grandchildren. Neighbors who trusted that powerful people would remember them when decisions were being made. Richard inhaled slowly, then asked the question nobody expected. Sheila? The entire room waited. Tell me how you know about that promise. Sheila's expression shifted, because answering that question meant revealing how this story truly began, and why she had been willing to risk humiliation to stop the signing. Richard had asked for the truth. He had no idea that the answer would change both of their lives forever. 6 months earlier, Sheila was not standing inside a prestigious law firm. She was standing in the basement of a small church in Ohio, holding a stack of notebooks in one hand and a plate of cornbread in the other, trying to stop 2 younger children from arguing over the same blue marker. Everybody cannot use blue at the same time, she said, raising one eyebrow. This is tutoring, not a courtroom. One of the children folded his arms. She always takes the good colors. Sheila placed the notebooks on the table and sighed dramatically. Fine. We are building peace today. You get blue for 5 minutes, she gets it after that, and nobody reports anybody to the Supreme Court. The children laughed, and just like that, the argument ended. That was Sheila. 17 years old, sharp, funny, and always watching what adults sometimes missed. Her neighborhood was the kind of place where people knew your business before you finished explaining it. On Saturdays, music drifted from open windows. Aunties called across porches, cousins argued over dominoes, and somebody always had food on the grill even when no one officially planned a cookout. Sheila loved it. She loved the church rehearsals where older women corrected every wrong note with love and volume. She loved the family gatherings where stories grew louder every time they were retold. She loved the elderly neighbors who asked for help carrying groceries but somehow ended up giving life advice for 30 minutes. Her grandmother had raised her with one rule Sheila never forgot. Respect people, she would say, but never be afraid of the truth. That sentence stayed with Sheila everywhere. At school, when teachers praised her essays. At home, when college applications sat open on the kitchen table. At the community center, when she helped younger children read words they had been afraid to say out loud. Sheila wanted college badly, but not just for herself. She wanted to become someone who could stand beside people who were ignored until it was too late. One afternoon, after tutoring, a church member handed her a flyer. Community outreach meeting this weekend, the woman said. Something about redevelopment. Sheila took it and read the bold letters. New housing, new jobs, new future. She smiled a little. That sounds good, but something in her chest told her to pay attention. And Sheila had been raised never to ignore that feeling. That weekend, Sheila arrived early at the community outreach meeting, with a pen, a notebook, and the same flyer folded neatly in her back pocket. The room was already filling with neighbors. Some came because they were hopeful. Some came because they were suspicious. Most came because whenever people in suits started promising a new future, somebody in the neighborhood wanted to know whose future they were talking about. A long table had been set near the front with folders stacked in clean piles. Sheila took one and sat near the side, close enough to listen, far enough to watch. A representative explained the project with a bright smile. Better housing, more jobs, new business opportunities. This is progress for everyone. A few people nodded. Sheila opened the folder. At first, most of the words sounded harmless. Community improvement, development access, temporary relocation, property transfer review. She paused. Temporary relocation. She read the sentence again, then the next page, then another. There were phrases she didn't fully understand, but she understood enough to feel uneasy. Some families could be moved before protections were guaranteed. Some properties could be transferred faster than residents could appeal. Some promises sounded big in speeches, but weak on paper. She lifted her hand. What happens to the people who already live there? The representative smiled. That will all be handled properly. Sheila frowned. Properly how? A man near the front chuckled. You're 17, right? Yes, Sheila said. And I can still hear when somebody doesn't answer a question. A few neighbors laughed softly. The man cleared his throat. These are legal documents. You may not understand all the terms. Sheila looked down at the folder, then back at him. I may not understand golf memberships, but I know when somebody's trying to move Grandma without asking Grandma. This time, the laughter spread across the room. But Sheila didn't laugh for long, because the documents still sat in her hands, and the uneasy feeling did not leave. Across town that same evening, Richard sat alone in his office, reviewing a separate copy of the redevelopment contract. His pen moved steadily across the margins until it stopped near a clause buried deep in the pages. He leaned closer. Read it twice. Then a third time. His expression tightened. For the first time since the project began, Richard whispered to himself, What exactly are we approving? The next afternoon, Sheila was at the community center helping a little girl sound out a sentence when someone at the front desk called her name. Sheila, there's a lawyer asking for you. Sheila looked up slowly. A lawyer? The little girl gasped. Are you in trouble? Sheila picked up her notebook and stood. Not yet, but give me time. When she reached the front office, Richard was standing near the doorway in a dark suit, holding a folder against his side. He looked, completely out of place beside the bulletin board covered with children's drawings, food drive notices, and church rehearsal reminders. Sheila folded her arms. You're from the redevelopment meeting, Richard nodded. I'm Richard. I reviewed some of the documents. That sounds like something, a lawyer says before making everything more confusing. He paused. Sheila tilted her head. You lawyers really enjoy making simple things sound expensive. For the first time, Richard almost smiled. I came because you asked the right question. Sheila didn't soften. Adults usually say that after they ignore the question first. Richard accepted that without arguing. You were right to be concerned, he said. There are clauses in the contract that could allow families to be moved before proper protections are confirmed. Sheila's face changed. So I wasn't being dramatic. No, Richard said. You were paying attention. Sheila looked toward the tutoring room, where children were laughing over a reading game. People keep saying this project will help us. But if it helps by pushing people out, that's not help. Richard opened the folder and showed her the page he had marked. I need to know where this version came from and who was told what. Sheila studied him carefully. Why are you telling me this? Because you noticed it first. No, she said. Why are you really telling me? Richard breathed out. Because if I stay quiet, I become part of the problem. That answer held her attention. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sheila reached for her notebook. Fine, we investigate, but don't talk to people like they're case files. Richard nodded. Understood. And don't wear that suit to my neighborhood cookout. He blinked. There's a cookout? There's always a cookout. By the time Richard left, he had made a decision that would change everything. He needed to see Sheila's neighborhood for himself. 3 days later, Richard found himself parked on a street that looked nothing like the neighborhoods he usually visited. Children rode bicycles up and down the sidewalk. Music floated through open windows. Neighbors sat on front porches calling greetings to people passing by. Someone waved at Richard before he had even stepped out of his car. You must be looking for somebody, an older woman called out. Before Richard could answer, Sheila appeared from across the street, carrying 2 trays covered with foil. There you are, she said. I was starting to think the GPS redirected you back to your country club. Richard adjusted the collar of his neatly pressed shirt. I don't belong to a country club. Sheila stared at him. You said that a little too quickly. He opened his mouth to defend himself before deciding against it. She handed him one of the trays. Good, carry this. What is it? Potato salad. Richard blinked. You brought a lawyer to a cookout and immediately assigned manual labor? You should feel honored, Sheila replied. Usually people have to earn this level of trust. As they entered the backyard, conversations paused. Several curious eyes landed on Richard. Then the introductions started. Within minutes, people were asking where he grew up, whether he had siblings, and why he looked nervous holding potato salad. Church mothers smiled politely while examining him with the intensity of experienced cross-examiners. So, one asked, what exactly are your intentions around here? Richard nearly dropped the tray. My intentions? Sheila pressed her lips together to stop herself from laughing. Children quickly discovered that Richard had absolutely no talent for dominoes. You can't put that there, one protested. I thought the point was to win, Richard replied. Not like that, another child said. By the 3rd round, he had lost badly. By the 5th, everyone knew it. Laughter followed every mistake he made. At first, Richard shifted uncomfortably under the attention, but gradually, something changed. Nobody cared about his title. Nobody seemed impressed by his profession. They cared whether he listened, whether he respected people, whether he showed up honestly. As evening settled over the neighborhood, Richard looked around at the families sharing food, stories, and responsibilities. He finally understood something the paperwork had failed to capture. This redevelopment wasn't simply about buildings, it wasn't statistics, it wasn't demographics. It was family history. A week after the neighborhood cookout, Richard invited Sheila to attend one of the fundraising events connected to the redevelopment initiative. When she stepped into the ballroom in downtown Ohio, she stopped walking. Women in elegant gowns moved gracefully across polished floors. Men in tailored suits discussed investments over carefully prepared meals. Servers carried silver trays through clusters of influential guests. Everything looked flawless. Everything sounded rehearsed. Richard noticed her expression. You okay? Sheila glanced around. I feel like somebody forgot to tell me this was an audition. Richard almost smiled. You get used to it. I'm not sure that's a compliment. As they moved through the room, Richard introduced Sheila to donors, executives, and community advocates. Many greeted her warmly. Some genuinely cared about improving neighborhoods. Others spoke passionately about helping families without realizing how. Disconnected their solutions sounded. One guest smiled brightly. We simply want to revitalize the area. Sheila tilted her head. Have you actually been there? The woman hesitated. Not personally. Oh, the response wasn't rude. It was honest. Throughout the evening, Sheila noticed something unexpected. Not everyone in rooms like these lacked compassion. Some people truly wanted to help. They just viewed communities through reports, presentations, and financial projections instead of conversations around kitchen tables. Later, while standing near the edge of the ballroom, Richard loosened his tie slightly. You know, he admitted, there's pressure in places like this. What kind of pressure? To appear certain, to protect your reputation, to avoid asking questions that make people uncomfortable. Sheila folded her arms. Helping people shouldn't require a ballroom. Richard looked down before nodding. No, he said quietly, it shouldn't. As they reviewed more documents together that evening, Sheila noticed another troubling detail hidden beneath the legal language. This wasn't simply about temporary relocation. Entire generations could lose the ability to return to neighborhoods there. Families had built over decades. Before we continue, have you ever felt ignored because of your age, background, or where you came from? Tell us in the comments below. Your voice matters, and we'd love to hear your story. Sheila slowly lowered the page. Richard, she said, I think we finally understand what this clause really does. By the time Sheila and Richard uncovered the true impact of the hidden clause, their investigation had settled into an unexpected routine. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't glamorous. Most nights looked the same. Stacks of documents spread across tables, highlighted pages, half-finished notes, cold takeout containers, coffee that had long stopped being hot, and conversations that drifted between legal strategy and ordinary life. One evening, Sheila walked into the church meeting room they had, borrowed for their research, and immediately stopped. Richard was laughing. Not the polite smile he offered at galas, actually laughing. Across from him sat Sheila's older sister. They were arguing over whether pineapple belonged on pizza. It's fruit, Richard said. Fruit doesn't belong there. Her older sister looked offended. Tomatoes are fruit. That's different. No, it's convenient. Richard opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Sheila slowly placed her backpack on the table. Oh, this is interesting. Both of them looked up. What? Richard asked. Nothing, Sheila replied innocently. She sat down and opened her notebook. 5 minutes later, she looked up again. You know, for two people discussing zoning protections, you both seem unusually invested in each other's opinions about pizza. Her older sister laughed. Richard reached for his coffee. We're just talking. Of course, Sheila said. Another evening, takeout boxes covered the table while they reviewed relocation timelines. Richard admitted he couldn't dance. I have absolutely no rhythm. Her older sister nearly choked, trying not to laugh. No rhythm at all? I've been informed that my dancing causes concern. Concern? I've received feedback. This time both sisters burst into laughter. Richard looked confused. I don't understand what's funny. Sheila leaned back in her chair, grinning. About time. Richard frowned. About time for what? She pointed between him and her older sister. You two have been making hard eyes over legal paperwork for weeks. Richard immediately inhaled his coffee at the wrong moment. He coughed so hard he nearly spilled it across the documents. Her older sister covered her face. You cannot say things like that. Why not? Sheila asked. I'm simply observant. The room filled with laughter. But moments later, the mood shifted. Richard returned to the evidence spread across the table. He pulled one final document from the folder, compared it to the previous versions, then went completely still, because together they had just found undeniable proof. The hidden changes hadn't been accidental. Someone had knowingly removed the protections families had been promised. The morning of the signing arrived with everything looking perfect on the outside. Inside the Ohio law firm, assistants moved quickly between glass offices, placing folders on tables and checking the guest list twice. Investors arrived in dark suits, speaking confidently about timelines, profit projections, and the future of the redevelopment project. Executives shook hands like the outcome had already been decided. This is a big day, one of them said. Another smiled. Once those papers are signed, we move forward. Richard stood near the main conference room with the final contract in his hand. To anyone watching, he looked calm, prepared, composed. But inside, he was measuring every detail against the proof he and Sheila had found: the missing protections, the changed language, the families who could lose their homes before anyone gave them a fair chance to respond. He had planned to delay the signing privately. Then, earlier that morning, a revised copy had arrived with the same dangerous clause still inside. No correction, no explanation, no warning. Richard had stared at the page for a long moment. Someone wanted this signed before questions could grow louder. Across town, Sheila was supposed to meet him before the signing began. But the bus was late. Then traffic slowed near downtown. She sat forward in her seat, clutching the folder against her chest, watching every red light steal time from her. Come on, she whispered. When she finally reached the building, she hurried through the lobby, breathless and worried. The receptionist looked up. Can I help you? I need to get to the signing meeting. That already started. Sheila froze. What? The woman checked the screen. They began 10 minutes ago. For 1 second, fear rushed through Sheila's body. 10 minutes was enough time for signatures, enough time for applause, enough time for families to be forgotten. She tightened her grip on the folder. Where? The receptionist hesitated. "Miss, you can't just—" But Sheila was already moving. She pushed past the polished hallway, following the sound of voices behind the large conference doors. Her heart pounded. Her shoes struck the floor faster. Inside, Richard lifted his pen. Sheila reached the doors and ran. The conference room doors flew open with enough force to silence every conversation inside. "Stop!" Sheila's voice echoed across the room. Dozens of heads turned at once. The polished confidence that had filled the Ohio law firm only moments earlier cracked beneath the weight of surprise. Richard looked up sharply. Investors exchanged irritated glances. Several executives frowned. One guest whispered, "Is that the same girl?" Another leaned toward the person beside him. "Who keeps letting her into these meetings?" Sheila stood near the entrance, breathing heavily from the run through the building. She could feel every eye studying her clothes, her age, and the fact that she didn't belong in their version of important spaces. Two security guards immediately stepped forward. "Miss, you'll have to leave." "No," Sheila replied. One guard paused. "This is a private meeting." "And those signatures will affect public lives," she answered. "I'm not leaving." Murmurs spread across the room. "Unbelievable. This is inappropriate. Somebody remove her." But Sheila never lowered her voice. She walked toward the signing table and pointed directly at the contract. Resting beside Richard. "Read page 43 again." The room grew quieter. Richard didn't move immediately. One executive spoke first. "We've already reviewed everything." "Then review it one more time," Sheila said. The irritation around the room deepened. A man near the back scoffed. "We're taking legal advice from a teenager now?" Sheila met his gaze. "No," she said calmly. "You're being asked to protect families before. Protecting schedules." Richard slowly reached for the folder. He opened it. The sound of turning pages cut through the silence, page after page, until he reached the clause. His eyes moved across the language, then stopped. He reread the sentence, then the paragraph. The color in his face shifted. Around him, people noticed. Richard wasn't a man known for hesitation. Yet now, one of Ohio's most respected attorneys looked shaken. Security stopped moving. The whispers faded. Nobody interrupted him. Finally, Richard closed the folder. The sharp sound echoed through the conference room. He lifted his head and looked around at everyone waiting for reassurance against her chest. She could feel the judgment in the room shifting. Instead, he said the words no one expected to hear. "We're not signing this today." The room erupted. The conference room erupted the moment Richard said the signing would not happen. "This is unacceptable. You cannot stop a project of this size because of one interruption. We have investors waiting. We have deadlines." Richard stood still while the complaints rose around him. Sheila remained near the side of the table, her folder pressed tightly, toward anger, but she refused to step back. One executive pointed toward her. "This girl has no authority here." Richard looked at him. "She has the truth?" That quiet sentence cut through the noise. Several people stopped speaking. Richard opened the contract again and turned it toward the room. Page 43, third paragraph from the bottom. A few investors leaned forward. Richard continued, his voice steady. "This clause allows relocation to begin before binding return protections are confirmed. It also leaves room for property transfers to move forward before affected families have a fair appeal process." Someone muttered, "That's not how it was explained." "No," Richard said. "It wasn't." The room shifted. Faces that had been confident moments earlier now looked uncertain. Richard placed one hand on the folder. This project was presented as an opportunity. Better housing, more jobs, new development. But opportunity that removes people without protecting them is not progress. An executive tried again. "We can correct language later." Richard shook his head. "Not after families lose leverage. Not after signatures make silence convenient." Then he turned slightly toward Sheila. A 17-year-old had the courage adults lacked. Sheila looked down, not embarrassed but overwhelmed. Richard faced the room again. She asked the questions we should have asked. She read what others rushed past. This signing is paused until community representatives are brought into the discussion. Resident protections are written clearly, and every affected family knows exactly what this agreement means. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then one investor slowly closed his folder. Another nodded reluctantly. The resistance did not disappear all at once, but the power in the room changed direction. The contract would not be destroyed. It would be rewritten. Community voices would finally sit at the table. Justice came without revenge, not through shouting louder than everyone else, but through truth standing firm long enough for people to do what was right. Months later, life in Sheila's neighborhood carried the same familiar rhythm she had always loved. Children raced down sidewalks on bicycles that looked like they had survived 3 generations of adventures. Neighbors called greetings from front porches. Music drifted through open windows. Someone laughed loudly enough for people halfway down the block to hear. And, as usual, somebody had decided that any excuse was a good excuse for a cookout. Only this time, there was more to celebrate. The revised redevelopment agreement had become a model for doing things differently. Community representatives had seats at every major discussion. Residents understood exactly what they were signing. Return protections had been written clearly. Families no longer feared waking up to discover decisions had been made without them. People still disagreed sometimes, progress still required compromise, but nobody was being ignored. Inside Sheila's home, envelopes covered the kitchen table, college acceptance letters, scholarship notifications, letters recognizing her advocacy and leadership. Sheila carefully opened another envelope, then stared. "What?" her older sister asked. Sheila blinked twice. "They said yes." Her older sister smiled. They'd be crazy not to. Another letter, another scholarship, another opportunity. Tears gathered in Sheila's eyes before she quickly wiped them away. "Don't start crying," she warned. "I'm not crying," her older sister replied immediately. "You already sound emotional. I'm simply preparing my speech." "You don't have a speech." "I absolutely have a speech." Sheila laughed. For months, people had praised her courage. But she knew the truth. She had simply asked questions many adults had been too busy, too intimidated, or too distracted to ask. Later that evening, the neighborhood celebration officially began. Children ran through sprinklers, screaming with delight whenever icy. Water caught them by surprise. Paper plates balanced on laps. Conversations overlapped. The smell of grilled food floated through the air. Richard arrived carrying dessert. He paused near the entrance to the backyard, smiling as familiar voices greeted him. Nobody treated him like Ohio's respected attorney anymore. They treated him like Richard. Someone handed him a drink. Someone else immediately asked him to move a folding table. A church mother pointed toward the food. "You've gotten thinner." "I don't think I have. Take another plate anyway." Richard had learned long ago that arguing was pointless. Nearby, Sheila watched him talking comfortably with neighbors who had once viewed him with suspicion. Her older sister stood beside him, laughing at something he had said. Their relationship had continued to grow quietly. No grand declarations, no dramatic promises, just mutual respect, shared values, consistent presence, the kind of affection built through ordinary moments. Then the music changed. Someone clapped. "Richard!" a voice shouted. "Dance!" He froze. "Oh no!" Children immediately gathered around him. "Come on! You promised! You can't say no!" Richard looked horrified. "I never promised." "You absolutely did," Sheila replied. "You've been waiting for this, haven't you? For months." He attempted one awkward step, then another. The result was exactly as terrible as everyone remembered. Children doubled over laughing. Adults covered their mouths. Even Richard started laughing at himself. Her older sister shook her head. "You really weren't exaggerating." "I told you," Richard said between laughs. "I've received feedback." Sheila wiped tears from her eyes. "Please stop before the sprinklers file complaints." Eventually the laughter softened into something quieter, the kind of peace that arrives when people know they have been seen. He found Sheila near the edge of the gathering. Children continued running through the yard behind them. Music floated gently through the evening air. Richard looked at her. "You changed my career." Sheila smiled. "You finally learned to read the fine print." He laughed, then grew thoughtful. "You reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place." Sheila looked back toward the celebration. "No," she said softly. "You remembered." Before we say goodbye, tell us in the comments what lesson stayed with you the most from today's story. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Those simple actions help stories like this reach people who may need encouragement, hope, or the reminder that one voice can still make a difference. Because heroes don't always wear suits. Sometimes they wear sneakers. Sometimes they're 17. Sometimes courage sounds like interrupting the room everyone else is, afraid to challenge. Integrity has no age. Love grows through understanding. Communities matter. And justice means making sure everyone has a seat at the table before the papers are signed.